Today at the Intelligence Forum's Who Are You podcast, we're privileged to have David Heymann, an infectious disease epidemiologist and someone with a deep understanding of public health issues. I'd like to start by asking David Heymann, David, you have and continue to have a more than interesting career. Where did it start, and would you tell us a little bit about the journey?
Well, thanks, Harry. In fact, the journey has been one of change constantly, really, taking advantage of what comes along at the time it comes along. So I started out in all this as a clinical doctor, taking care of patients. And I was very interested in continuing my training in that area, but this was during the Vietnam War. And I came from a small town in northern Pennsylvania, and the draft board, the board at that town, told me that I would be drafted into the Army, but that I had the option of joining another service if I wished. And so I did. I actually joined what's called the Public Health Service, thinking I would be away from any combat duty. But as soon as I began my public health service in July of the year that I was selected, which I believe was 1981, I was assigned to a sampan searcher in the Vietnam Delta, in the Mekong Delta. However, I was getting my injections, getting ready for that, and the ship was Vietnamized, turned over to the Vietnamese to do the sampan searching that ship was doing with the Vietnamese officers and crew. And so I was assigned to an icebreaker to go to the Antarctic, where I spent a year in the Antarctic. The second year I was in Northern California in a clinic in a Coast Guard training center because I was assigned to the Coast Guard from the Public Health Service. And at the training center, I continued my clinical medicine. After finishing, however, I was qualified for what's called the GI Bill. And I decided that that was a bill which provided training funding for people who had been in the military. So I decided to come actually to London to learn clinical tropical diseases, taking care of patients with tropical diseases at the St. Pancras Hospital for Tropical Diseases, which no longer exists. I came to London through the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and just as I was finishing clinical training, D.A. Henderson, the head of the smallpox eradication program at the World Health Organization, came to our class seeking people to go to India to work on smallpox eradication with Indian counterparts. I couldn't resist that. I wasn't married. I had no family at that time. And so I went to India. And after that, through a series of events, I became actually an accidental epidemiologist and public health worker.
You've worked, some of these questions are a little bit all over the place, but you've worked on the eradication of polio. And how does the world stand on this situation today regarding polio?
Well, you know, when the polio eradication program was begun, it was thought that it would be as easy to do as had been smallpox eradication, which was quite easy for many different reasons. However, what's happened is that the polio eradication program has had many, many setbacks, political setbacks, and also the fact that the vaccines used to eradicate polio actually convert in nature to the same type of virus that causes polio. And so, despite the fact that Africa is now polio free with what used to cause polio, today polio is occurring again from what's called vaccine derived polio. So we see that it's been set with many different problems, and hopefully eventually polio will also be eradicated, but it's still quite a ways in the future, even though the target was 2020 and missed, the target was 2000 and was missed 25 years ago.
Am I also correct that tuberculosis cases are on a slight increase in the UK? And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, tuberculosis is having a difficult time in many, many countries because of the fact that this bacteria that causes tuberculosis has become resistant to many of the traditional treatments. And so there has to be extra attention to making sure that it's treated with antibiotics, which actually stop the infection from spreading. So it's a very difficult program to do. And what we're seeing is in many cases, a resurgence of tuberculosis because of the fact that it's resistant to current treatment.
Another question I'd like to ask you, and that's social media. I wondered if it was friend or foe to somebody like yourself working in public health.
Social media can be both a friend and a foe. It can be a friend if messaging is coming from a trusted face, from someone who everyone trusts. On the other hand, there are people who are trusted who aren't giving the proper message, and therefore it makes it complicated. Trusted faces give the right message. Other faces, which are also very important on social media, give the wrong messages. And so all this has begun really way back in the late 19th century when there was an anti-vaccination movement in the UK against smallpox vaccination. And since then, periodically, there have been rumors that vaccines are dangerous. And currently, there are many, many different rumors, which really was spearheaded by an article by someone named Wakefield back in the late 1990s, which was published in The Lancet, and which said that measles vaccine caused autism, where in fact, this was an article which was not properly reviewed and was rescinded by The Lancet. But by that time, it had spread around the world and given the anti-vax movement more ammunition to convince people not to take vaccines. That's why we're seeing vaccination decreasing and measles outbreaks, for example, increasing throughout the world.
I mean, do you have some thoughts on the anti-vax movement as to how you can counter that without too much confrontation, I mean, do you have any perspective on how that can be addressed? The misinformation that's provided, perhaps?
I think it's just by a trusted face, someone who has been known either nationally, regionally, or globally, who can convince the people that vaccinations are safe, despite the fact that in some countries, such as my own in the US, the actual Minister of Health or the Secretary for Health has some questions about the effectiveness of vaccines, which has never occurred in the US before in the official government readings. I come from the Center for Disease Control in the US, based in Atlanta, and we've never had a problem with credible recommendations until it's been marginalized by many different events that have occurred.
I mean, after COVID, is the world better prepared, in your view, for the next event such as that and the next pandemic?
Certainly we can hope so, but many times political leaders have a short memory. And also what's very important for political leaders is a rapid gain. Preparedness for pandemics is not a rapid gain. It's a long-term solution. It doesn't benefit the minister or the politicians today. It benefits those in the future. And especially in pandemic preparedness, it's a very difficult issue to address because it not only concerns strong public health, but it's a fact that there need to be resilient health systems which can take care of people who are affected by a pandemic, and also other people in the community who have routine health issues, which didn't occur in many countries during the COVID pandemic. In addition, we've seen during the pandemic that those people who suffered most from infection were those with comorbidities, diabetes, hypertension, overweight, and the elderly, as opposed to those who were in good health. So it's a very big challenge to be prepared, and it takes many different avenues, including making sure we understand what's going on in the animal population so that those breaches that occur between animal and human populations don't occur and cause epidemics in humans.
The last question I'd like to ask you is, I did read that Woodrow Wilson possibly went to Versailles after the First World War with the flu, the Spanish flu. And I just wondered, having looked at that, obviously it was a major event, that flu outbreak of 1918. And I wondered if you had any perspective on that and had looked at it.
Yes, in fact, I think it's quite unusual that people should be comparing current day pandemics in influenza to those that occurred in 1917, because back then there were no antibiotics available. And what happens in influenza, which is caused by a virus, which doesn't respond to antibiotics, is that bacteria many times superinfect or infect the lungs, which have been affected by the flu virus, and you get a bacterial pneumonia infection, which kills. And so people were dying from the fact that this was a very virulent influenza virus, but also from the fact that they couldn't have the bacterial infections which occurred coincidentally with influenza treated. And so those people who would have gotten better from influenza maybe continued to get sick from bacterial infections and died. Today we have antibiotics. We have vaccines which can prevent bacterial infections on top of influenza. And so we're seeing hopefully much less mortality now and in the future.
David Heymann, it's been a great pleasure to have you here today, and thank you very much indeed for it. I'd also like, at the end of this meeting, to thank Christina Czech, who, without her, nothing would have happened, as the engineer of this meeting, and thank you.